They put a price on her future before she was old enough to fight back. And the men who did it never expected her to fight back at all. At 23, Lena Ashcroft had already buried both parents, survived years under her uncle's roof where she was kept like a debt waiting to be collected, and listened through a doorway while two men calmly divided up the rest of her life between them. One document, one arrangement. No one asked her a single thing. She could have stayed quiet. Most people in her position would have. She didn't. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button, drop the name of your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The morning they tried to sell her, Lena Ashcroft was standing in the kitchen of her uncle's house washing dishes that weren't hers, in a dress that had belonged to her mother, thinking about how quietly a person's life could be taken from them. She heard the voices before she saw the men. Her uncle, Douglas Pratt, had a particular way of speaking when money was involved. Slower, with a kind of oiled patience that made Lena's stomach turn even when she couldn't hear the words clearly. She'd grown up recognizing that voice. It was the voice he used with cattle buyers, with creditors, and now it seemed with a man named Clifton Hale. Lena set down the dish. She dried her hands slowly on the cloth tucked into her apron string. She walked to the doorway of the sitting room and stood there, and neither man looked up at her immediately, which told her everything she needed to know about how they thought of her presence. Clifton Hale was 51 years old and carried himself the way men do when they've never once been told no and believed it. He had a wide jaw and small eyes, and the kind of suit that cost real money but was worn badly, the collar too tight against a neck that had thickened with years of good meals. He was holding a folded document in one hand and tapping it against his knee with a slow, satisfied rhythm. "The arrangement is straightforward," Douglas was saying. "She's of age, she's healthy, she's got no debts of her own. The terms we discussed last month still stand." "They do," Clifton said. His eyes finally moved to Lena. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's already decided to purchase, assessing, not particularly curious. "She's thinner than I expected." "She works hard, that'll serve you fine." Lena felt the blood in her face go hot and then cold in the same breath. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe, but she didn't move. She wanted to hear it all. She needed to. "The timing works for me," Clifton said. He unfolded the document and smoothed it across his knee. "I'll need her settled before summer. My daughters require a stepmother who can manage a household. I'm not looking for a companion. I'm looking for someone functional." "She's functional," Douglas said, and he said it without any embarrassment at all, which was the thing Lena would remember longest about that morning. Not the words, but the complete absence of shame in the man who had been trusted with her care. She stepped into the room. Both men looked up. "I'm not going to marry him," Lena said. The words came out steadier than she felt. Her voice didn't shake. She was almost surprised by that. Douglas's face shifted through several expressions in the span of a second. Irritation, calculation, and then a particular kind of coldness that she recognized from the night he told her she couldn't stay in the house past her 23rd birthday unless she started earning her keep in ways that went beyond cooking and cleaning. "Lena," his tone said, "don't embarrass me." "I heard what you said. Both of you." She looked at Clifton Hale directly. "I'm not property. I don't know what he told you or what you paid him or what you think this document means, but I won't sign it and you can't make me." Clifton's expression didn't change much. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's mildly inconvenienced. "Your uncle has legal guardianship," he said. "In this territory, that carries weight." "I'm 23 years old." "You're living under his roof, using his food and his firewood. The courts tend to see dependency as a form of obligation." He said it pleasantly, almost gently, which was worse than if he'd said it with contempt. "I'm not a cruel man. I simply require order in my household. You'll adjust." "I won't be adjusting to anything," Lena said, "and I'll be gone from this house before nightfall." She turned and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Douglas say something low and sharp, and Clifton's voice answering with that same patient oil. She didn't listen to it. She went to the small room off the back of the kitchen that had been hers since the day her parents died, barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, and she began putting her things together. Her hands were shaking now. They'd been waiting for the privacy to do it. She had $11.40 saved in a tin box under a loose floorboard. She'd been saving for 2 years, skimming what she could from grocery money and laundry coins, not because she'd had a specific plan, but because some part of her had always known that a day like today would come, that someday her usefulness to Douglas Pratt would take a shape she couldn't live with. She put the money in her dress pocket. She put 2 changes of clothes, her mother's silver comb, and a small photograph into the canvas bag she'd owned since girlhood. She put on her coat. She picked up the bag. Then she sat on the edge of the cot for one moment. She was 23 years old, and she had $11.40 and nowhere to go. She stood back up and walked out the back door. She spent 2 nights at the rooming house above the dry goods store on Whitfield Street, run by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who didn't ask questions so long as you paid in advance and were quiet after 9. Lena paid for 3 nights, which left her with less than $9, and she sat on the edge of that narrow bed and thought about the shape of her options. She wasn't trained for anything that paid decently. She could cook, clean, sew, manage a household, keep accounts. She taught herself bookkeeping from her father's ledgers after he died, spending evenings with his old records until the columns made sense to her. But none of that translated easily into employment that wouldn't put her back inside someone else's house under someone else's authority, which was precisely where she was trying not to be. On her second morning in the rooming house, she went to the mercantile and looked at the notice board. Most of the notices were for men: cattle work, freighting, mine labor. There were 2 for domestic service in town, both of which she passed over quickly. The families were known to her, and one of them was friendly enough with Douglas that her presence there would travel back to him within a week. There was a notice for a cook at the railroad camp 20 miles east, which paid reasonably but required living in a tent city with 300 men, which she wasn't willing to consider. And then there was the card at the bottom of the board. It was written in a precise, unornamented hand on heavy stock paper, the kind a man uses when he's not trying to impress anyone, just to be clear. Seeking capable housekeeper for remote ranch property, Callaway Ridge, 12 miles northwest of Harlan's Fork. Must be able to manage large household independently. References preferred but not required. Reasonable wages. Inquire at the Harlan's Fork livery. Ask for Donovan. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Callaway Ridge. She knew the name, vaguely, the way you know things about people who exist at the edge of your world. Heard in passing, never examined closely. Grant Callaway, one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. A man who'd made a great deal of money and spent very little of it on being sociable. She'd heard him described as difficult, private, possibly arrogant. She'd also heard that he paid fairly and kept his word on a contract, which, given the current state of her options, ranked considerably higher than sociable. She took the card off the board. The liveryman in Harlan's Fork was a thick-necked Scotsman named Donovan, who looked at her with open skepticism when she presented the card and said she was inquiring about the position. "You've done household management before?" he asked. "Since I was 16, she said. "My father's house, then my uncle's. I can cook, clean, manage accounts, oversee supplies, organize staff if there are any. I'm not easily put off by hard work or bad weather, and I don't need to be in town to be content." He scratched his jaw. "It's a long way out. Not much company." "I'm not looking for company." He studied her for another moment, then pulled out a piece of paper and wrote something on it. "Mr. Callaway's coming through day after tomorrow. He'll make the decision himself. You can wait here or come back." "I'll come back," she said. She spent the interim day walking the perimeter of Harlan's Fork, learning its geography, noting the general store and the doctor's office and the post, and the 2 saloons and the small church she had no use for. She ate sparingly and slept in the livery's spare room, which Donovan offered without being asked, in exchange for sweeping out the stalls in the morning. She swept them thoroughly. Grant Callaway arrived on a Tuesday, in a wagon loaded with feed sacks, and he was not what she had expected. She'd built up some version of him in her mind. The wealthy rancher, the difficult man, whatever that meant. And the version she'd assembled was probably broader across the chest and louder in the way he held himself. The actual Grant Callaway was lean and roughly 40, with a face that had been weathered past the point of handsomeness into something more enduring than that. He had dark eyes that moved quickly and a jaw that was set with the permanence of a man who'd spent years making decisions alone. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves and reached across to shake hers, were calloused in the specific way of someone who doesn't just own cattle work, but does it. He looked at her the way Clifton Hale had looked at her, but it wasn't the same look. Clifton had been assessing property. Grant Calloway was assessing a person, trying to figure out what she was actually made of. "Donovan says you came in off the road," Grant said. "I did." "Where from?" "Whitfield." He waited, and she understood he was waiting to hear more, and she chose not to give it. Let him decide whether that was suspicious or simply private. She watched him make the calculation. "You've managed a large house before?" "Not as large as what I understand Calloway Ridge to be, but I'm a quick learner and I don't make the same mistake twice." "That's what everybody says." "Most people are lying when they say it," she said. "I'm not. You'd be welcome to ask the people I've worked for." She had prepared 2 names, neither of them Douglas, neither of them problematic. Mrs. Gable had agreed to vouch for her, and there was a widow 2 streets over from Douglas's house who'd hired Lena for a season of laundry and mending 3 years ago and had been satisfied enough to say so to anyone who asked. Grant looked at her a moment longer. Then he said, "The position pays $12 a month plus room and board. The house has been without regular staff for 8 months. It'll take some work to get it back in order." "That's fine. I'm not home most of the time during the working season. You'd be largely on your own." "Also fine. There are 2 ranch hands who sleep in the bunkhouse. You'll have no problems from them. If you do, you come to me." "Understood." He picked up his gloves from the railing. "I'm leaving in the morning. You can ride back with me or make your own way." "I'll ride with you," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He nodded once and walked back to his wagon, and she couldn't tell if he was satisfied with the exchange or simply finished with it, and she supposed it didn't much matter. She had a position. She had $12 a month and a roof and a reason to be somewhere that wasn't here. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than she'd had yesterday. The road to Calloway Ridge took most of a morning and passed through country that opened steadily as they traveled, the town thinning behind them, the hills going longer and broader, the sky getting that quality it gets in open land where it stops being background and starts being the main thing you're looking at. Lena sat on the wagon bench beside Grant Calloway, and neither of them spoke much, which suited her fine. He asked once how old she was. She told him. He didn't react to it, which she appreciated. She asked once about the house, how many rooms, whether there was a root cellar, what the water situation was. He answered directly and without condescension, which she also appreciated. Some men talk to women about domestic logistics, the way they talk to children, slowly and with exaggerated patience. Grant Calloway answered her like she was a contractor he'd hired to do a job. She was starting to think she might be able to work here. The house, when it came into view, gave her a moment of something she hadn't expected. She'd prepared herself for functional, 4 walls, a roof, manageable. What she saw was a structure that had once been genuinely fine and had been allowed to go neglected, which was different from a house that had always been rough. The bones were good. The porch had sagged on one side and the windows needed work, and there was a general air of things having been set down and not picked back up, but underneath all of that was something solid. She climbed down from the wagon and stood looking at it. "It needs work," Grant said behind her. "Yes," she said. "I can see that." She looked at it for another moment. "It'll be good, though, once it's sorted." He didn't answer that. She heard him begin unloading the feed sacks. She picked up her bag and walked up the porch steps and went inside. The first week was mostly inventory. She went through the house room by room with a notebook she'd bought in Harlan's Fork, cataloging what was there and what was missing and what needed repair and what needed replacing. She found that the kitchen was the best maintained room in the house. Someone had cared about that, at least, at some point. But the 2 main bedrooms and the sitting room and the study had all accumulated the kind of disorder that happens when a person lives alone and doesn't see the point in fighting it. There were stacks of papers on the desk in the study that turned out to be ranch records, 3 years of them, loosely organized. She didn't touch them yet. That wasn't her business unless he made it her business. She found, in the back of a linen closet, a box of photographs. She didn't look through them. She put them back exactly as they were. The 2 ranch hands, brothers, as it turned out, named Pete and Cal Marsh, were polite and kept their distance, which was exactly what she'd hoped for. Pete was 30 and quiet and did his job. Cal was 26 and had the kind of easy friendliness that wasn't romantic, just habitual. And he said good morning to her every day like it was a religious obligation and seemed satisfied with whatever brief response she gave. Grant was away most days before she was up and back after dark. She left a plate for him in the warmer most evenings. She didn't wait up and didn't expect conversation. This was an employment arrangement. She'd been hired to do a job. She did it. By the end of the second week, she had the kitchen reorganized, the main bedroom aired and cleaned, the sitting room cleared of its disorder, and rearranged with a practical logic that she wasn't sure he'd notice, but would make the room function better. She'd taken inventory of the stores and made a list of what was needed. She'd found a loose board on the porch and wedged it stable with a piece of scrap wood she found behind the barn, not because it was strictly her job, but because someone was going to trip on it eventually. On the 14th night, she came into the kitchen after supper to find Grant sitting at the table. He was looking at the list she'd made of supply needs. He'd been out since before dawn, and she could see the tiredness in the set of his shoulders. "This list," he said, without looking up. "If any of it seems excessive, I can prioritize," she said. He looked up then. "It's not excessive. It's the most sensible accounting of what this house needs that I've ever seen." He set the list down. He looked at her with that same direct measuring quality he'd had on the day they met. "You wrote this in 2 weeks." "I've been here 2 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The room at the end of the hall, the one I told you to leave alone." "I left it alone?" "I know." A pause. "That was my wife's room. She died 4 years ago." Lena didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned that sorry was often just noise people made to fill a silence, and that some silences were better than noise. She nodded once, and she looked at him steadily, and she let him decide what happened next. What happened next was that he stood up, said goodnight, and went down the hall. She listened to his footsteps. She cleaned up the kitchen. She went to bed. But something had shifted, small and irreversible, the way things do when a person tells you a true thing they didn't have to tell you. She'd been at Callaway Ridge for 6 weeks when Douglas found her. She'd known he might. She'd known it the way you know a storm is coming. Not because you can see it yet, but because the air has changed and your bones know it before your eyes do. She'd been careful. She hadn't written to anyone in Whitfield. She'd done her shopping in Harlan's Fork when she went, not in any town closer to Douglas's territory. She'd been quiet about where she was and what she was doing. It didn't matter. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when the wind was coming hard from the north and Grant was out on the far grazing land. Douglas pulled up in his wagon and climbed down with the patient deliberateness of a man who'd prepared what he was going to say. Clifton Hale was not with him, which surprised her, and then didn't, because Douglas was smart enough to know that Clifton's presence would make her less likely to listen. She was on the porch when he pulled up. She didn't go to him. She waited. "You're looking well," Douglas said. "What do you want?" she said. He came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped there, his hat in his hands. This was a performance of humility, she recognized. Douglas Pratt only held his hat in his hands when he wanted something from you. "I want you to come home," he said. People in town are talking, Lena. You're here, alone, at a man's ranch. Whatever the situation actually is, people are saying things. It reflects badly on the family." "There is no family," she said. "Your aunt knew exactly what you were planning and said nothing." She kept her voice level. This wasn't anger, or at least it wasn't only anger. It was the kind of clarity that comes when you've had 6 weeks away from a thing to see it properly. "I'm not coming back, Douglas. I'm employed. I have a contract and I'm fulfilling it. Whatever you arranged with Clifton Hale is not my concern." His hat moved in his hands. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not remorse, she thought, but recalculation. "He's a patient man," Douglas said. "He's willing to wait. He understands the situation is, I'm not going to marry him. The legal situation, there is no legal situation. I'm 23 years old, I'm employed, and I'm not living under your roof. Whatever claim you think you have, you don't." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to leave this property." His face hardened. The performance of humility was over. "You think this cowboy is going to protect you?" he said, and his voice had changed. Still controlled, but with an edge under it now, something she recognized as the real Douglas, the one who lived underneath the surface patience. He doesn't know you. He hired a housekeeper. The moment this becomes complicated, he'll want no part of it. And then where are you? You'll have nothing, at least with Clifton. Get off this property, she said, and her voice was still level, and she was still standing on the porch without moving, and she was determined that he would remember her like this, not running, not crying, not backing down. Or I'll send for the sheriff and we can have this conversation with him present. Your choice. The wind moved between them. Douglas stood at the foot of the steps for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She could see him calculating whether she'd actually do it. She would. She absolutely would. He put his hat back on. This isn't finished, he said. I know, she said. But today it is. He got back in the wagon. She stood on the porch and watched him drive away until she couldn't see the wagon anymore. And then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Her hands were shaking again. She waited until they stopped. Then she started on supper. She didn't tell Grant about it that night. She thought about it while she was cooking, turning over whether to tell him, what it would mean if she did, whether it changed anything about her position here. She decided against it. It was her business. She'd handled it. She would keep handling it. But 2 days later, Pete came into the kitchen in the morning, looking uncomfortable, and said that he'd seen a man in a wagon parked on the road the day before, just watching the property. He hadn't done anything, just sat there. Pete had gone out to ask him what he wanted, and the man had driven off. Dark wagon? Lena said. Yes, ma'am. Big fella. Got a look on him. She thanked Pete and told him if it happened again to let her know. That evening, she told Grant. She told him plainly who Douglas was, what had been arranged, what had happened on the porch, and what Pete had seen. She didn't ask for anything, and she didn't dramatize it. She gave him the facts in order and then stopped talking. Grant listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. How long ago did your parents die? He asked. The question surprised her. It wasn't what she'd expected him to lead with. My mother when I was 17, she said. My father when I was 20. Douglas took me in because there was an inheritance. Modest, not much, but enough that my father had left it in Douglas's management until I married or turned 25. Douglas was to provide my care in the meantime. And the marriage to Hale would have transferred whatever was left of the inheritance to Douglas, with a portion going to Hale. I believe that was the arrangement. She paused. I didn't know that for certain until I heard them talking. Grant nodded slowly. He looked at the table. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not pity, not that. Something quieter. I'll send word to the sheriff in Harlan's Fork, he said. Not because I think the law will do much. It likely won't. But because if it comes to trouble later, there should be a record that you were here legitimately and that a man was watching the property. That's sensible, she said. You're not planning to leave. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. No, I'm not. He looked up at her then, and there was something in the look. Not warm, exactly. Not yet, but present in a way it hadn't quite been before. Like he was seeing her more clearly. All right, he said. She nodded. She cleared the supper dishes. She went to bed. Through the window above her cot, she could see the stars, which came in hard and thick out here the way they never did in town. She lay looking at them for a while. She thought about her parents, briefly. The way she sometimes did at night when the day was done, and there was nothing left to do but be honest with herself. She had been terrified on that porch. She'd been terrified and she'd done it anyway. She supposed that was all courage ever was, doing the thing while the fear was still there, not after it was gone. She turned over and went to sleep. Down the hall, past the door she'd never opened and would never open without permission, she heard the house settle around her. Old wood, good bones, something that could be made into something. She was already doing that. She could feel it. The letter from the sheriff's office in Harlan's Fork arrived 9 days after Grant sent word, and it said approximately what Lena had expected, that the matter had been noted, that Douglas Pratt had no legal standing to compel her return, and that if the man on the road persisted in watching the property, they should send for the deputy. It was the kind of letter that existed more as a paper record than as an actual promise of help, and Lena filed it in the small tin box she kept under her cot alongside her money and her mother's photograph, and tried not to think too hard about what it would actually mean if Douglas decided to stop watching and start doing something. What it meant, practically, was that she had the law's acknowledgement and not much else. She'd known that going in. She put the letter away and went back to work. October came in hard that year, earlier than people expected, the temperature dropping through the first week with a sharpness that made the cattle restless and had Pete and Cal working longer days than usual to get the last of the fall grazing moved before the ground turned. Lena noticed the shift in the rhythm of the ranch, the way the mornings got quieter and the evenings got longer, the way Grant came home with mud on his boots and a particular set to his jaw that meant he'd been making decisions all day and wasn't done making them yet. She adapted to the rhythm without thinking much about it. That was something she'd always been able to do, read a household's tempo and move inside it without disrupting it. Her mother had been the same way. Her father used to say that some people make noise wherever they go, and some people make room, and that both were necessary, but the second kind were rarer. She thought about her father sometimes, in the kitchen in the early mornings before anyone else was up. Not with grief exactly. Grief had done most of its acute work in the years right after he died, and what was left was more like the steady awareness of an absence, the way you're always slightly conscious of a room in a house that's locked. She missed him practically. She missed his particular way of seeing problems. He'd been an accountant by training and a rancher by circumstance, and he'd approached everything, ledgers, broken fences, difficult neighbors, with the same methodical patience, looking for the logic underneath the surface mess. She'd inherited the patience. She wasn't sure she'd inherited the calm. But it was the ranch accounts that changed things between her and Grant, though neither of them would have identified it that way at the time. She'd been reorganizing the study. Not the desk, she'd left the desk alone, but the shelves and the floor around it, which had accumulated the kind of sediment that happens in a room where a person works alone for years, when she found, behind a stack of old farming catalogs, 3 ledger books that had been started and abandoned, each one spanning about 8 months of records before the entries stopped mid-page and were never continued. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at the active ledger on the desk, which she'd glanced at once and then deliberately not looked at again because it wasn't her business. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and thought about it. The thing was, she could see from the single glance she'd had that the current ledger's entries were accurate but inefficient. The kind of record-keeping that works fine if you know exactly what you're doing and never need anyone else to make sense of it, but that would be nearly impossible for a bank or a buyer or a lawyer to read quickly. Her father's early ledgers had looked the same way, before he'd developed his system. She wasn't going to touch Grant's ledger. That was clear. But she could, if she were careful about it, if she framed it right, show him what she meant. She spent 2 evenings reconstructing the last quarter's supply purchases from the receipts she'd been keeping since she arrived, organizing them in her own notebook in the format her father had taught her. Column headers, monthly subtotals, a running balance that could be checked at a glance, notes on which suppliers were giving better prices than others. When she was done, it covered 6 pages and was clear enough that anyone could read it in 10 minutes and understand exactly where the household money was going. She left it on the kitchen table one morning before Grant came down. She was in the garden pulling the last of the fall vegetables when she heard him come in, and she stayed in the garden longer than she needed to, giving him time, not wanting to make it into a thing. When she came inside, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him. He looked up. "You did this from the receipts," he said. "Yes." "In the evenings?" "It didn't take long. My father kept his accounts the same way. It's a useful format if you ever need someone else to read them quickly. A bank, a solicitor, anyone like that." He looked back down at the notebook. He turned a page, then another. His expression was the one she'd come to recognize as his version of being impressed. Not demonstrative, just a slight softening around the eyes, a fraction of loosening in the jaw. "My wife kept the household accounts," he said, and then he stopped, as if he'd said more than he'd intended. Lena waited. "After she died, I just did it myself," he said, "the way I'd always done the ranch accounts. It works well enough." "It does," she said. "I'm not suggesting it doesn't. I just thought, if it's useful." She paused. You don't have to do anything with it. He closed the notebook. He looked at her with that measuring directness she'd grown used to. How much of the ranch ledger have you looked at? None, she said. That's your business, not mine. I was working with the household receipts only. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Most people would have been curious, he said. I'm curious about plenty of things, she said. That doesn't mean I act on all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to show you how the ranch accounts are organized. In case something happens to me, someone should know where things are and how to read them. The in case something happens to me landed strangely. She thought about the 3 abandoned ledgers she'd found on the shelf. She thought about what 8 months of not maintaining records meant, about what a man's life could do to itself when he stopped seeing the point in keeping things in order. All right, she said, and kept her voice even. He showed her that evening, after supper. It took 2 hours. The ranch accounts were more complex than she'd expected. Multiple streams of income, cattle sales and grazing leases, and a small timber operation she hadn't known about, all of it running through a system that Grant had built himself over years, and that was, in its own way, brilliantly organized, just inaccessible to anyone but him. She asked good questions. He answered them without condescension. They sat at the desk in the study for 2 hours, and by the end of it she understood the broad structure of what he was running, and he understood that she understood it, and neither of them said anything about what that meant. She went to bed that night with the numbers still organizing themselves in her head, fitting together the way puzzles do when you finally see the shape of them. November brought the first real snow, and with it a visitor Lena hadn't expected. Her name was Ruth Adler, and she arrived on a Thursday in a wagon driven by her grown son, who waited outside while Ruth came up the porch steps with the particular careful authority of a woman who has survived enough winters to stop being polite about the cold. She was 60 or so, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pinned back severely, and a face that had been pretty once and was now something better than that. You're the Ashcroft girl, she said, when Lena opened the door. I'm Lena Ashcroft, Lena said. Can I help you? Ruth Adler. My husband has the spread 12 miles east. She looked past Lena into the hallway with the frank curiosity of someone who had known this house before. I heard Grant finally hired someone. Thought I'd come and see for myself. She looked back at Lena. You going to let me in out of the cold? Lena stepped back. Of course, come in. Ruth Adler was, as it turned out, the closest thing to a neighbor Callaway Ridge had, and she'd known Grant for 15 years, and she had a way of looking at the freshly cleaned and reorganized sitting room that told Lena she was measuring exactly what had changed since her last visit and drawing conclusions from it. The curtains, Ruth said, settling into the chair Lena indicated. I washed them. They were gray. They were always gray, even when Helen was alive. She said Helen's name without flinching, which Lena noted. Ruth was not someone who talked around things. I heard about your situation with your uncle and the hail business. Lena went still for just a moment, then continued pouring tea. News travels. Everything travels out here, nothing else to carry. Ruth accepted her cup. Hail's a nasty piece of work. I've had dealings with his kind before. Men who think buying something with money is the same as having a right to it. She looked at Lena over the rim of her cup. You handled it well, from what I hear. I handled it adequately, Lena said. It isn't finished. No, Ruth agreed. It never is with men like that. But adequately is where you start. She looked around the room again. Grant's been alone too long. Helen died and he just closed up, like a house that nobody's bothering to maintain. She paused. I don't mean that the way it might sound. I know what you mean, Lena said. I've seen it in houses. Ruth looked at her sharply, then laughed. A short, genuine sound. Nothing performed about it. You have a practical mind. I'm told it's not always a compliment. It is when it's real. Ruth set her cup down. I'm going to tell you something, and you can do with it what you like. People in Harlan's Fork are talking about you being out here. Some of it's decent talk, some of it isn't. The decent people say Grant finally did something sensible. The others say... She stopped. You know what they say. I can guess. It doesn't seem to bother you. It bothers me, Lena said. I've just decided it bothers me less than the alternative. Ruth studied her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the satisfied air of someone who has confirmed a thing they already suspected. Good, she said. She stayed for 2 hours and left with the same brisk competence with which she'd arrived, and Lena stood on the porch and watched the wagon go and felt, for the first time since coming to Calloway Ridge, something that was not quite loneliness and not quite its opposite, but something shifting between them. Grant came home that evening to find Lena on the porch in her coat, in the cold, watching the last light leave the sky over the western ridge. He pulled up, unhitched the horse, and came up the steps, and he paused when he saw her face. Ruth came by, he said. It wasn't a question. She did. He leaned against the porch railing. He was tired. She could see it in the line of his shoulders, the slight drag and how he'd climbed the steps. What'd she say? Mostly sensible things. Lena glanced at him. She said people in town are talking. They're always talking. About me. About this. She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the house and the space between them and everything unsaid. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just informing me. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the property and made its low sound. Does it change anything for you? He asked. What people are saying. She thought about that honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. No, she said, but I thought you should know what's being said. It's your reputation, too. He looked at her. My reputation's been whatever it is for 15 years. I don't need much tending. A pause. What people think about why you're here. It doesn't concern me unless it concerns you. I told you it doesn't. All right, then. He pushed off the railing. Is there supper? There's stew, she said. It's been keeping. Good. He went inside and she listened to his boots on the floorboards, and after a moment she followed him in out of the cold. It was 2 weeks after Ruth's visit that Lena found Helen Calloway's recipe box. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been reorganizing the bottom shelf of the kitchen pantry, pulling everything out to see what needed replacing, and there it was behind the flour canister, a small wooden box, painted once and now faded to a soft pale color, with a lid that stuck slightly when she opened it. Inside were recipes written in a slanted, hurried hand on cards and scraps of paper, and the torn edges of envelopes, some of them smudged with old flour or oil. She should have put it aside, she knew that. It wasn't her box. But she sat on the kitchen floor in the cold morning light, and she looked at the cards, not reading them exactly, just looking at the handwriting, at the evidence of a woman who had existed here, who had stood at this same stove and made bread and, based on the notes in the margins, had opinions about exactly how long a pie crust needed to rest, which were strong opinions, stated firmly and with several underlinings. She put the box on the shelf where she could see it. Not to use it, not yet, maybe not ever, that wasn't her call, but because it seemed wrong to put it back behind the flour. That evening, Grant saw it. He was getting a glass of water and he stopped. He looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Lena was at the table and she waited and she did not explain herself. He reached out and touched the side of the box with 2 fingers, not opening it, just touching it. I found it in the back of the pantry, she said. I thought it shouldn't be back there. He took his hand away. No, he said. You're right. He looked at it a moment longer. Then he got his water and went down the hall. She heard his door close. She sat at the table and let the evening settle around her. The thing about grief, her father had told her once, is that it doesn't diminish exactly. It just reorganizes itself. You build a bigger house, and it takes up the same amount of space, but the rooms around it grow, and so it seems smaller even when it isn't. She hadn't known, at 17, what that meant. She was starting to understand it now. Eat. December arrived, and with it 3 things. The first serious cold that kept them all closer to the house than they'd been. A letter from Douglas that she did not open and put directly in the stove. And Grant Calloway standing in the kitchen doorway one morning, watching her work with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She noticed without acknowledging it, The way she'd learned to notice things in this house, sideways, without making it into a confrontation. She kept working. She was making bread, which was a task that required the kind of attention you could simultaneously perform and set aside, and she let the silence sit until it decided to become something. "You burned a letter," he said. She looked up. "Yes." "From Douglas." "I assumed." He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter. "Don't you want to know what it said?" "Not particularly. If it was a threat, I'd rather not read threats first thing in the morning. If it was an appeal, it doesn't change anything. If it was both, which is more likely, it definitely doesn't change anything." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm afraid of him," she said, pulling the dough over on itself. "I've just decided not to live inside that fear. There's a difference." He was quiet with that for a moment. "My father was afraid of losing this land," Grant said. She had the sense he hadn't planned to say it. He'd built it from nothing, and he'd had it threatened twice, once by drought and once by a man who tried to buy the note on his mortgage and then called it in early. He lived inside that fear for the last 15 years of his life. It made him— He stopped, started again. It made him smaller than he was. Lena stopped working. She looked at him, and he was looking at his coffee, and there was something open in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerable, exactly, because Grant Calloway wasn't built for that word, but unguarded. "You didn't let it make you smaller," she said. "Not about the land." A beat. "About other things." She let that sit without pressing on it. She went back to the bread. The kitchen was warm from the oven, and outside the window the snow was falling straight down in the windless cold. She used to make bread on Saturdays, he said, and Lena understood without needing to ask who he meant. "I'd come in and the whole house smelled." He stopped himself again. "That's a good memory to have," Lena said quietly. "Yeah." He drank his coffee. "It is." Neither of them said anything else for a while, and the bread rose the way bread does when you give it time and don't push it. And Lena thought about the recipe box on the shelf and the handwriting with its firm underlinings and its opinions. And she thought that Helen Calloway had probably been a woman worth knowing. She thought she was sorry she hadn't gotten to. Quote, Christmas came and went with little ceremony. A decent meal, some quiet, Pete and Cal going into Harlan's Fork to see their family for 2 days, and coming back red-faced from cold and apparently from whiskey as well, though she didn't say anything about that. Grant gave her a small wage increase and said it without ceremony, and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she thanked him and said she appreciated it, and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and that was that. January was hard. The cold came in sideways that year, with wind that made the temperatures mean in a way that still cold doesn't. The cattle were restless, and Grant was out more than usual. And there was a week where he came home 3 nights running looking like something had gone wrong, and she asked on the 3rd night what it was, and he said one of the outer fences had come down in the wind, and 2 steers had gotten into the Adler property, and it had taken most of the week to sort it out. Ruth wasn't difficult about it? Lena asked. Ruth was exactly as difficult as she needed to be, he said, which was such a precise and not unaffectionate assessment of Ruth Adler that Lena almost laughed, and she saw the corner of his mouth move slightly, which was as close to laughing as she'd seen him come. It was the small moments like that, she was realizing, that accumulated, not the large ones, not the conversations about grief or money or Douglas. Those mattered too, but they stood separate, like landmarks. What built the actual texture of things was the small stuff. The way she'd learned that he liked his coffee strong and his eggs simple, and that he would eat whatever she made without complaint, but showed his appreciation for certain things by finishing them and not saying anything, which was more honest than compliments. The way she'd learned that when he was thinking hard he went quiet, in a different way than when he was just tired. A more interior quiet, a turned inward quality. The way he'd started lingering at the kitchen table in the morning sometimes, not talking necessarily, just present, in a way he hadn't been those first weeks. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, sideways, without making them into more than they were. She was his housekeeper. She was doing her job. She was doing it well enough that the house had come back to life around them both in ways that surprised even her sometimes. The sitting room that had been cold and neglected now had a fire most evenings and someone to sit by it. The kitchen that had been functional now smelled like food that someone had actually considered. The general atmosphere of the house that had felt like a man maintaining a structure rather than living in it had shifted into something more like actual habitation. She'd done that. She wasn't unaware of it. What she was careful not to do was let the awareness of it mean more than it did. He was a man in a hard business, alone for a long time, who had hired her to do a job. She was a woman with no money and no family, and a man 2 towns over who thought she owed him something. She was 23 years old, and she had been afraid, and she had run, and she had landed here. And it was a good landing, a better one than she'd had any right to expect. That was enough. She reminded herself of this when necessary. She was in the middle of reminding herself of it one evening in late January when Pete knocked on the kitchen door and came in with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had not seen from him before. "Got a man in the yard," he said. She set down what she was doing. "Douglas?" "Don't know him. Older fella, dressed nice." A pause. "He says he's Mr. Hale." The warmth of the kitchen seemed to contract slightly. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Pete and then at the window, where the dark outside had made it a mirror. "Where's Grant?" she said. "Up in the north field still. Won't be back for an hour at least." She untied her apron. She hung it on the hook by the door. She smoothed her dress, not because she cared what she looked like, but because her hands needed something to do. "Tell him I'll be out in a moment," she said. Pete looked uncertain. "You sure you don't want to wait for Mr. Calloway?" "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." She took a breath. Then she went to the front door and opened it, and Clifton Hale was standing on the porch of Calloway Ridge in the January cold, and his expression when he saw her was the same one he'd worn that morning in Douglas's sitting room. Patient, certain, mildly inconvenienced by the gap between where things were and where he intended them to be. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. She looked at him, and she thought about the recipe box and the accounts, and the bread rising on the counter, and Ruth Adler drinking tea in the sitting room, and the way the house had come alive around her over these past months. And she thought about how none of that had been given to her. She had built all of it. She had done the work. She kept the door open behind her. She stood in the lamplight that spilled out from the hall. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I suggest you tell me exactly what you've come here for, because I have supper on the stove and I'd like to get back to it." He didn't smile. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has not yet solved, but is confident he will. "We need to talk," he said. "All 3 of us. You, me, and Mr. Calloway." "Mr. Calloway isn't here," she said. "So you can talk to me or you can leave." He studied her for a moment. The cold moved between them. "Then we'll talk," he said. Clifton Hale was not a man who liked standing on porches in January cold, and Lena knew it from the way he shifted his weight slightly to his left and kept his jaw tight against the temperature. She didn't invite him inside. She wasn't going to invite him inside. This house was not his to stand in, and whatever he'd come to say could be said out here in the cold, where she could see his face clearly, and where Pete, she knew, was somewhere nearby in the dark. "Talk then," she said. He looked at her with that particular patience, the patience of a man who had more money than she did and thought that settled most arguments before they started. "The arrangement between your uncle and myself is a legal document, Miss Ashcroft, signed, witnessed, and filed with the county clerk in Whitfield." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, held it toward her. "Your uncle retained counsel. The position is that your departure constitutes a breach." She didn't take the paper. "A breach of what?" "Of the agreement for your care and provision. You were housed and fed under his roof under the expectation that I would eventually be handed over to you," she said. "Yes. I was in the room when you said it." She looked at the paper in his outstretched hand and then back at his face. "I'm not going to touch that. I'd like you to put it away." He held it a moment longer, then folded it back into his coat. Something moved in his expression. Not anger, not yet, but a recalibration, the way a man adjusts his approach when the first one doesn't land. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said. "I want you to understand that. What Douglas and I arranged, I'll be honest with you, I know it wasn't handled well. You were not consulted. That was wrong. He said it with the tone of a man who has practiced saying it and doesn't mean it, the kind of apology that's actually just a different kind of leverage. What I'm proposing now is a conversation, a reasonable one. Between you and me. Between you, me, and Mr. Calloway, when he returns. Mr. Calloway has no standing in this, she said. I'm his employee. My personal circumstances are not his business to negotiate on my behalf. That surprised him. She could see it. A small fracture in the patience. He'd expected her to use Grant as a shield, or to be afraid without one. He hadn't expected her to simply decline both options. You're a 23-year-old woman with no family, no property, and no legal standing of your own, he said, and his voice stayed measured, but something underneath it had gone harder. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because it's the practical situation. Your uncle's claim on your care is documented. My claim on the agreement we made is documented. What's your counter to that? Employment at a ranch? Yes, she said. That's exactly my counter. I'm employed under a lawful contract. I'm housed under my own arrangement. I have wages, and I have the law's acknowledgement that I'm here legitimately, in writing, from the sheriff in Harlan's Fork, dated November. She'd known she would need that letter eventually. She'd kept it out of the tin box and in the pocket of her good dress for the past 3 weeks. She pulled it out now and held it where he could see it without offering it to him. Whatever document you and Douglas filed in Whitfield, it was filed without my knowledge or consent, and it cannot compel me to marry anyone. You know that. Which is why you came here to talk instead of sending a lawman. The cold settled between them. Clifton Hale looked at her for a long moment. She made herself hold still under that look, made herself breathe evenly. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I've had time, she said. He looked past her into the hallway, at the lamplit interior of the house, and she saw something pass through his expression that she couldn't entirely categorize. Not desire exactly, but a kind of appraisal that went beyond her specifically and encompassed the whole situation, the house, the money behind it, the position she'd somehow arrived at. Mr. Calloway is a wealthy man, he said. It wasn't a question. That's not your business, she said. It becomes my business if he's the reason you're refusing a legal arrangement. He's not the reason, she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended, harder than she wanted it to, because the suggestion that she was only standing here because of someone else's money made something in her chest pull tight. I'm the reason. I was the reason in November, and I'm the reason now, and I'll be the reason the next time you or Douglas decide to come here. There's no version of this conversation where I end it differently. Go home, Mr. Hale. He was quiet. The wind picked up slightly off the ridge and moved between them. I'll speak with Mr. Calloway, he said. That's his choice to make. Good night. She went inside and closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back to the door and her heart hitting hard against her ribs. She could hear her own breathing. She made it slower deliberately, the way her father had taught her when she was a girl and prone to panic. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count to 4, do it again. She heard Hale's footsteps on the porch steps, then the crunch of snow underfoot, moving away. She waited until she heard the horse, and then the sound of it leaving. Then she went back to the kitchen and finished supper. Grant came home 40 minutes later to find her at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and something in her face must have told him before she said anything, because he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. What happened? He said. Clifton Hale was here. She set the cup down. He's gone. I spoke with him on the porch and asked him to leave. Grant's expression went through something she didn't often see, a sharpening, fast and quiet, like a man who's heard a sound in the dark and is locating it. He set his gloves on the counter. He came to the table and sat across from her, not beside her, across, where he could see her face. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it, in order, the same way she'd told him about Douglas weeks earlier, plainly, without dramatizing it, what was said and what she'd said back, and what she'd shown him. When she got to the part about the sheriff's letter, his jaw went tight, and she saw him start to say something and then stop himself and let her finish. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. You told him I had no standing in it, he said. You don't. Not legally. Not in a way that would help. She looked at him directly. If I'd said you were protecting me, Hale would have reframed the whole thing as a dispute between two men over a woman. I didn't want that. Grant looked at her. Is that the only reason? The question sat there. She thought about answering it the practical way, the way that kept things simple. And then she decided against it because Grant Calloway asked direct questions and deserved direct answers. No, she said. I also didn't want to use your position as a crutch. I've been carrying this situation myself since July. I'm not going to hand it off because he showed up with a document. Something shifted in his face. Not the measuring look. Not exactly. Something warmer than that, though she wasn't sure he was aware of it. He said he'd speak with me, Grant said. He might come back. You should know what to expect. She paused. I won't ask you to turn him away on my behalf. If he comes here and you want to hear what he has to say, that's your right. It's your property. It's your home, Grant said, and said it simply, without weight, as if it were just the accurate word for a thing. She felt it land somewhere she wasn't prepared for it to land. Thank you, she said, just as simply. He stood up. I'm going to send a letter to the county clerk in Whitfield. Ask for a copy of whatever document Douglas filed. If it's as he described it, we'll know exactly what it says and what it doesn't. That's sensible. And I'm going to speak with the attorney in Harlan's Fork, not to fight your battle, he added, and his voice was careful with that, but to understand what the terrain looks like. All right, she said. He picked up his gloves. Eat something. You've been sitting here with cold tea. She almost laughed. Yes, she said. I'll eat something. The document from Whitfield arrived 2 weeks later and was, as Grant's attorney in Harlan's Fork explained when he read it, largely without teeth. Douglas had filed a petition asserting guardianship rights and seeking the return of his ward, but the petition had not been granted by a judge. It was a filing, not a ruling. Without a court order, it compelled nothing. What it does, the attorney said, his name was Mercer, a thin, careful man in his 50s who spoke the way people do when they've learned to be precise, is establish that your uncle made a formal attempt. If he pursues it further and seeks a hearing, there's a process, but the filing alone has no force. Lena listened to this sitting in the chair across from Mercer's desk, with Grant beside her, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest that she hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding. What would Douglas need to take it further? She asked. A sympathetic judge and evidence that you're either incompetent to manage your own affairs or dependent on him in some material way. Given that you're employed, housed independently, and of age, neither is easy to establish. Mercer looked at her over his glasses. The more time passes, the weaker his position gets. In my experience, men who file these things without following through usually do so to apply pressure rather than from genuine legal confidence. That's consistent with Douglas, she said. Then my advice is to continue as you are. Document your employment and independence carefully, and don't do anything that could be construed as acknowledging his authority over you. He looked at Grant briefly. Including anything that would make your situation here more complicated than it already is. She understood what he meant by that. She didn't look at Grant. On the way back, in the wagon, neither of them said anything for the first 10 minutes. The road ran between fields that had gone white and flat in the February cold, and the sky was the particular pale gray of winter that isn't quite overcast and isn't quite clear. Mercer's right about the document, Grant said finally. Yes. And about the other thing. She looked at him. He was watching the road. I know, she said. He nodded. Neither of them said anything more about it. Well, what she hadn't anticipated was the town. Not Harlan's Fork specifically, though that was part of it. She'd known people were talking. Ruth had told her that, and she'd factored it in as something to tolerate and set aside. What she hadn't fully understood was how concrete that talk would become when Clifton Hale started spending time in the area. He'd taken a room at the Harlan's Fork Hotel in mid-February. Not a short stay. A sustained presence, a man settling in with the patience of someone who has decided to wait a thing out. He was seen at the general store and at the land office and at the saloon, and he talked to people the way men with money and time do. Casually, easily, letting things fall that were designed to seem accidental. Ruth told Lena what was being said at the end of February, when she came out to the ranch for one of her visits. He's telling people the situation here isn't what it appears, Ruth said. She had the directness that Lena had come to appreciate. No cushioning, no softening, just the information delivered cleanly. That Grant has taken in a runaway young woman under circumstances that aren't proper. He's not saying anything specific. He doesn't have to. He just implies. He's trying to make my position here untenable, Lena said. Yes, and he's trying to make Grant's position uncomfortable enough that Grant asks you to leave. Ruth looked at her. Would Grant ask you to leave? I don't think so, she said, but I won't put him in a position where he has to keep choosing. What does that mean? Lena had been thinking about it for 3 days since she'd first heard Hale was in town. She'd been turning it over the way she turned over supply problems and account problems and logistical problems, looking for the shape of the solution underneath the shape of the difficulty. It means I'm going to Harlan's Fork, she said. Ruth looked at her steadily. To do what? To have the conversation publicly. She met Ruth's eyes. Hale is working in the margins because that's where rumor lives. If I go into town, face him directly, and make my position clear in front of people, not behind doors, not in private, in front of the community, then there's no margin left. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That's either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, Lena said. Most things worth doing are. She chose a Saturday because the town was fuller on Saturdays. More people in from the surrounding ranches, the general store busy, the street not empty. She dressed in her good dress and her good coat, the same ones she'd worn to Mercer's office, and she hitched the small wagon herself because Grant was out, and she didn't ask Pete or Cal. She drove into Harlan's Fork alone. She went to the general store first, because that was where news traveled fastest and where the most people passed through on a Saturday morning. Vera Halston, who ran the store with her husband, was a woman who knew everything that happened in a 30-mile radius and made no secret of it, and she looked at Lena with sharp, interested eyes when she came in. Miss Ashcroft, she said, haven't seen you in town in a while. I've been busy, Lena said. She bought what she needed, flour, salt, 2 pounds of coffee, and while Vera was packaging it, she said conversationally, the way you say things you want repeated, I heard Mr. Hale is still in the area. He is, Vera said. Her hands kept moving on the packages, but her attention sharpened. I wonder if you'd tell me where he usually is on a Saturday morning, Lena said. I'd like to speak with him. Vera looked at her. The hotel dining room most mornings. He takes his breakfast late. Thank you, Lena said. She paid for her purchases. She left them with Vera to collect later and walked to the hotel. The hotel dining room had 8 tables, and 6 of them were occupied when she walked in. She recognized 3 faces. A rancher named Briggs, who'd done business with Grant, his wife, and the deputy sheriff, a young man named Cord who ate here most Saturdays. Clifton Hale was at a table by the window with Douglas Pratt, and when she saw Douglas, her step faltered for just a fraction of a second before she steadied. She hadn't known Douglas was here. She hadn't anticipated that. She walked to their table. Both men looked up. Douglas's face went through several things quickly. Hale's went through nothing. He composed himself faster than that, set his coffee cup down, looked at her with that same measured patience. Miss Ashcroft, he said. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do. She was aware of it, the peripheral awareness of eyes and paused conversations. Mr. Hale, she said, I'm glad I found you. I'd like to speak to you clearly, since I think the conversations we've been having privately haven't accomplished much. She didn't look at Douglas yet. She kept her eyes on Hale. You've been in this town for 2 weeks. I understand you've been talking to people about my situation at Calloway Ridge. I've had conversations, he said evenly. So have I. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, which was not what he'd expected. She could see that, because it changed the nature of the scene from a woman standing over a table being questioned to 2 people sitting down as equals. I want to be plain about something. The document you and Douglas filed in Whitfield was reviewed by an attorney. It's a petition without a ruling. It has no legal force. My employment at Calloway Ridge is documented, my wages are paid, and my presence there is entirely proper. She said it clearly enough that it carried to the adjacent tables without her needing to raise her voice. If you believe otherwise, you're welcome to take it before a judge. My attorney in Harlan's Fork is Mr. Mercer on 4th Street. He'll answer any questions about the legal position. Hale was watching her. His face was still. You've prepared for this conversation, he said. I've been preparing for it since July, she said. I'm not going to marry you, Mr. Hale. I want to say that clearly and in front of people so that there's no confusion later about what I said and when I said it. I am not refusing because of pressure from anyone else. I am refusing because I am 23 years old and it is my right to do so, and no document filed without my consent, in a clerk's office I was never consulted about, can change that. Douglas made a sound. She looked at him for the first time. He looked older than he had in November, and she registered that without satisfaction. She'd spent a long time being angry at Douglas Pratt, a hot, corrosive anger that had gotten her out of his house and gotten her on the wagon to Harlan's Fork and gotten her through the first weeks at Callaway Ridge. That anger had done its work. What she felt looking at him now was something cooler and more durable. You planned this, Douglas said. His voice was tight. I came to town to buy flour, she said, and to say what needs saying. She stood up, which put her above them again, and she looked at both men. I hope you'll enjoy your time in the area, Mr. Hale. I hope the hotel is comfortable, but I'd ask you, when you've finished your business here, to go home. There's nothing left for you in this county. She turned and walked to the door. Behind her she heard nothing for a moment, a full, held silence, and then the sound of someone at another table beginning to talk again, quietly at first, and then with the normal energy of people who have just witnessed something and are processing it together. She pushed out the door into the cold. She stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel for a moment. Her legs were steady. Her hands were not, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Cord, the deputy, came out of the hotel behind her. He was a young man, 25 maybe, with a straightforward face and the kind of decency that hadn't been complicated yet by too much experience. He looked at her with something between admiration and concern. That was something, he said. I hope it was something useful, she said. Word'll be around town by noon, he said, for what that's worth. It's worth something, she said. Thank you, deputy. She went back to the general store and collected her packages and loaded them into the wagon and drove back to Callaway Ridge. And the whole way back she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Something light and clean that sat in her chest where the fear had been. Not the absence of fear, not quite, but something that had grown up next to it that was bigger. Grant heard about it before she got home. She didn't know how, Ruth probably, or Donovan at the livery, but he was standing on the porch when she pulled into the yard, and his expression when she climbed down from the wagon was one she hadn't seen from him before. She couldn't entirely read it. Not anger, not quite. I heard you went to town, he said. I needed flour, she said, and she met his eyes, and she saw his mouth move slightly at that. The same small, involuntary, almost amusement she'd seen before. Cord sent word, Grant said. He described it in some detail. She brought the flour up the porch steps, and he held the door for her, which he didn't usually do, and she went inside and set the flour on the kitchen counter. Are you angry? She asked. She turned around to face him. He'd come inside behind her and was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, looking at her. No, he said. I didn't involve your name. I didn't imply. I know. Cord told me that too. He looked at her steadily. I'm not angry. He stopped. I don't know exactly what I am. She waited. When Helen got sick, he said, and his voice changed with the name the way it always did, a slight roughening. She kept saying she was fine, for months. She kept saying she could handle it, that it wasn't bad, that it would pass. By the time I understood how bad it was, we'd lost time we couldn't get back. He was quiet a moment. I've spent 4 years being careful about not missing things, not assuming people are fine when they aren't. He looked at her. You went into town alone and faced those men, and you didn't say a word to me about it beforehand. She understood now. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to try to come with me, she said quietly. And if you'd come with me, it would have looked like you were fighting my battle. And if it had looked like that, it wouldn't have worked. I know, he said. That's the thing. I know all that. It was the right call. A pause. I still didn't like hearing about it afterward. She looked at him for a moment. I'll tell you next time, she said. Something settled in his face. I'm not asking for permission rights, he said. I'm just... He stopped again, then more quietly. I just want to know when you're walking into something difficult. That's all. All right, she said. That's fair. He nodded. He started to turn away and then didn't. What you did today, he said. Hale won't forget it. I know. It'll either send him home or make him serious. He said it with the directness she'd grown to depend on from him, not softening it, just stating it. We should be ready for the second. Yes, she said. I know that too. He looked at her, and in the kitchen light she saw something in his face that had been building slowly, quietly, without announcement. Something that was not just the measuring look of an employer, not just the concern of a man who'd grown used to someone's presence, but something more personal than either, something that lived in a different place than practicality. She saw it, and she put it aside carefully, the way you set aside something fragile when you're not sure yet where it should live. I'll start supper, she said. I'll be in the study, he said. He went down the hall. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the warm air and thought about a woman with strong opinions about pie crust, and a man who'd built a ledger system no one else could read, and a house that had been closed up for a long time and was not closed anymore. Then she started the fire under the stove and got to work. Hale did not leave. She'd half hoped he would. The rational half, the part that understood that public confrontation was a form of calling a bluff, and some men, when their bluff was called, folded. But she'd also half known he wouldn't, because Clifton Hale had not gotten to 51 years old and accumulated what he had by being the kind of man who folded easily. What he did instead was systematic and patient in the particular way that scared her more than anger would have. He began meeting with landowners, not Grant, not yet, but the men who bordered Callaway Ridge, who had dealings with Grant in the ordinary way of neighboring ranches. She heard about it from Ruth and from Pete, who heard things in town, and pieced together a picture that was methodical and deliberate. Hale was inserting himself into the local fabric, making himself useful and present and known, establishing himself as a man with resources and intentions in the county. He wasn't just waiting her out. He was setting something in motion. Grant understood it immediately when she told him in early March. He stood in the study looking at the map of the surrounding properties that she'd found in his files and thought out loud in the spare, organized way he had when he was working through a problem. He's not here just for you, Grant said. I don't think he ever was, she said. Or not only for that. He looked at her. What do you mean? She'd been thinking about it for a week, turning it over. When he came to Douglas's house, when I saw them together that morning, Douglas had a document. Hale had a document. There was talk about the inheritance my father left. But my father's estate was small. What Douglas is holding in management isn't worth coming out here and spending 3 weeks in a hotel for. She paused. Unless there's something else, something bigger. Grant looked at the map. His finger moved to the ridge that marked the western boundary of Callaway Ridge. There's been a man from the Railroad Survey Office in town since January, he said. I didn't connect it. She looked at the map. The railroad. If the line comes through this county, and there's been talk of it for 2 years, it comes through the ridge. The land on both sides would be worth... He stopped. His jaw went tight. Considerably more than it is now. The shape of it assembled itself in her mind the way the accounts had assembled themselves, column by column, the logic becoming visible. Hale wants the land, she said. Douglas has enough connection to the properties around here through his dealings with my father's estate to be useful. And me... A wife from the area gives him standing, Grant said. A local connection. Community credibility when he makes his moves on the surrounding properties. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the March temperature. She thought about Hale sitting at the table at the hotel, patient and certain. She thought about the way he'd looked past her into the house that first night. Not at her, but at what surrounded her. She had never been the point. She had been a means to a point. Grant, she said. I'm thinking, he said. She let him think. Outside the study window, the snow was starting to go soft in the first uncertain warmth of approaching spring, and the ridge was visible in the gray afternoon light, long and solid, and completely unaware of what the men below it were planning. She looked at it and she thought, not if I can help it. She wasn't sure yet what helping it would look like. But she was already beginning to understand that what Hale had set in motion was larger than a forced marriage and a petition filed in a county clerk's office, and that standing up in a hotel dining room, while necessary, had been only the first move in something that was going to require more from her before it was done. Her hands were steady. She was ready. The railroad surveyor's name was Aldous Fenn, and he was a thin, nervous man in his early 40s who had the habit of looking at the ground when he talked to you, as if the conversation existed somewhere near his boots. Grant found him at the land office in Harlan's Fork on a Thursday in mid-March, and came back that evening with the kind of expression Lena had learned to read as controlled anger, the version where the anger was real, but he wasn't going to let it run ahead of his thinking. She set a plate in front of him and sat down across the table and waited. "The survey is real," Grant said. "Fenn confirmed it, or most of it. The railroad company is seriously considering a route through this county. Final decision won't come until summer, but the preliminary work is done." He looked at his food without eating it. "The route goes through the western ridge, which means it goes through the edge of my property, through the Adler spread, and through 3 smaller holdings between here and the county line." "And Hale knows this," Lena said. "Hale probably knew it before he came here. He has connections to people who would have access to survey information before it becomes public." His jaw was tight. "The land along that route, once the railroad confirms it, that land doubles in value, triples some of it." Fenn wouldn't say it directly, but he said enough. "So Hale wants to buy up the holdings along the corridor before the announcement," she said, "or pressure people into selling before they know what they're sitting on." Grant pushed his plate aside. "Briggs, the rancher I've known for 12 years, who I had dinner with in December, Hale has met with him 3 times. I heard today that Briggs is considering an offer." "What kind of offer?" "Low. Below what the land is worth right now, let alone what it'll be worth in 6 months." He looked up at her. "Briggs doesn't know about the railroad, or he knows something's coming but doesn't know enough to understand what his land is actually worth." Lena thought about this. She thought about the map on the study wall and the ridge, and the way things connected when you looked at the whole shape rather than the individual pieces. "He needs to know," she said. "Yes. And so do the others." She was already thinking through it. Not quickly, not in a rush, but in the methodical way her father had taught her, working from what was known outward. If the people along the corridor understand what's coming and what their land is actually worth, Hale's strategy falls apart. He's counting on their ignorance. That's exactly what he's counting on. Grant looked at her. "The problem is that I can't go to my neighbors and tell them there's a railroad coming based on a conversation with a surveyor who was careful not to confirm anything directly. Fenn could deny it. Hale would deny it. It would look like I was spreading rumors to interfere with legitimate business." "You'd need documentation," she said. "I'd need documentation that I don't have and that Fenn won't give me." She nodded slowly. She got up and cleared his plate even though he hadn't eaten much, and she brought him coffee. Not because making coffee solved problems, but because her hands needed to be doing something while she thought. "Who at the railroad company would have filed the survey request?" she said. "Regional office in Cheyenne." "Is the survey a public document once it's filed?" He looked at her. "I don't know." "Mercer would know," she said. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. "I'll ride to town tomorrow." Mercer knew, and the answer was complicated in the way legal answers usually were. The survey itself was not yet public record, but the land office filings associated with it, the right-of-way inquiries that necessarily preceded any serious survey, those were public. Had been public for 4 months. Anyone could have looked at them. Most people hadn't, because most people didn't know to look. "If I prepare a summary of the filed documents," Mercer said carefully, looking at Grant and then at Lena, who had come to town this time and sat in the second chair across from his desk. "A factual summary, citing only what is a matter of public record. I can have no control over how that summary is used or to whom it is shown." Grant looked at him. "How long would that take?" 2 days, Mercer said. "If I start today." "Start today," Grant said. They drove back to the ranch in the early afternoon, and there was something different about the quality of the silence between them on that road. Not the comfortable working quiet they'd developed over months, but something more alert, two people moving toward the same thing and aware of each other in the movement. "We'll need to go to each of them personally," Lena said. "Not just send the document. People need to hear it explained." "I know." "Ruth first. She'll understand it quickest, and she knows the Briggs family well." He glanced at her sideways. "You've already mapped it out." "I've been thinking about it since March," she said, "since we understood what Hale was actually doing." He looked back at the road. A pause. "You could have left," he said. "When it became clear this was bigger than just Hale coming after you. You could have taken your wages and found another position somewhere without this attached to it." She looked at the road ahead. The snow was almost entirely gone now, the fields showing the first brown-gray of ground that was thinking about becoming something. "This is my home," she said. She said it the same way he had said it to her in January, simply as the accurate word. She felt him register it, not with surprise exactly, but with something. Neither of them said anything else until they reached the ranch. Mercer's summary arrived on a Saturday, and by Monday morning Grant and Lena had been to see Ruth Adler, and through Ruth had arranged to meet with Briggs and two other neighboring ranchers by Wednesday. They went together. Lena had expected Grant to suggest she stay at the ranch, not from condescension, she thought, but from the habitual instinct of a man who was used to handling things alone, but he didn't. He simply said, at breakfast on Monday, "You should come. You understand the account side of it better than I explain it." She brought her notebook with the figures she'd compiled from Mercer's documents, organized in her father's column format, clear enough to read at a glance. Ruth took 15 minutes to understand the full picture and another 5 to be furious about it, which was a faster processing time than Lena had expected, and exactly what she should have expected. "He sat in my kitchen," Ruth said. Her voice was flat and very controlled, which on Ruth Adler meant the anger was serious. "In November. He came by to introduce himself. Had 2 pieces of my pie." A pause. "He was scouting the property." "Yes," Grant said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Lena's notebook, which was open on the table between them. "This is what the right-of-way filings show." "Exactly as filed," Lena said. "Mercer prepared the summary from public record." Ruth looked at it for another long moment. "Briggs needs to see this before the end of the week. He's meeting with Hale again on Friday." "We're going to Briggs tomorrow," Grant said. "I'll come with you," Ruth said. It was not a request. Briggs was a big, slow-spoken man of 55 who had the careful distrust of someone who'd been misled before and hadn't forgotten what it cost. He looked at the documents for a long time and asked several questions and looked at them again. His wife stood at the kitchen doorway through most of the conversation and didn't say much, but her face said plenty. At the end of it, Briggs sat back in his chair and looked at Grant. "If I'd sold on Friday," he said. "You'd have gotten about 1/3 of what it'll be worth," Grant said. "Maybe less." Briggs was quiet. His wife came away from the doorway and sat at the table and didn't ask permission to join the conversation, which told Lena something about how that household worked. "What does Hale do when he finds out you've told us this?" Briggs asked. "He'll be angry," Grant said, "and he'll try something else." "What else can he try?" Grant looked at Lena briefly. She looked back at him, and then at Briggs. "We don't know yet," she said honestly. "We know enough about how he operates to expect that he won't simply leave. But we also know that his strategy here depends on acquiring the land quietly before the announcement. Once that's not possible, his leverage in this county is significantly reduced." Briggs's wife had been looking at Lena through this whole exchange. "You're the girl from the Calloway house," she said. Not unkindly. "I work for Mr. Calloway," Lena said. "Yes." "Ruth says you're the one who figured out what Hale was actually doing here." "Grant and I worked it out together," she said. The woman nodded, studying her. Then she said to her husband, "Cancel Friday." They reached the other 2 neighboring ranchers by Thursday. One understood immediately and was grateful and angry in equal measure. The other, a younger man named Sweeney who'd inherited his property 2 years ago and was still finding his footing in it, was harder to read. He listened, asked careful questions, and said he'd think about it, which could have meant several things. On the way back from Sweeney's property, the sky had gone the particular dark gray that meant weather, and the wind had picked up in a way that Pete, when they returned, called serious with a flatness that suggested he'd seen enough Wyoming weather to know the difference between serious and not. "How bad?" Grant asked. "Bad enough," Pete said. "Temperature's dropping fast. We've got maybe 6 hours before it hits." The cattle were in the lower grazing fields, 300 head, and the lower grazing fields were exposed. Getting them moved before the storm hit was a calculation that Lena watched Grant make in about 4 seconds. She could see it in his face, the rapid assessment of time and distance and manpower. "I need both of you," Grant said to Pete and Cal. "All night if it takes it." "We know," Cal said. He was already pulling on his heavier coat. Lena looked at the sky. "What do you need from me?" Grant looked at her. "The storm shelter at the south end of the property. It hasn't been opened since fall. I need to know the latch is clear and the inside is accessible if we need to move the herd through there." "I'll go now," she said. "The path's half a mile through the back field. Take the lantern from the barn and—" "I know where the shelter is," she said. "I've mapped this property. Go." He went. She went the other direction. The temperature had already dropped 4 degrees by the time she crossed the back field, which she knew because she could feel it with a precision that comes from paying attention to things. The lantern threw a yellow circle on the frosted grass ahead of her, and the wind was coming from the northwest now, steady and building, the kind of wind that doesn't stop and get stronger but maintains a constant pressure that wears at you. The shelter latch was iced over. She worked at it with her hands, and then with the screwdriver she'd had the foresight to put in her coat pocket when she left the barn, because she'd thought about what latch might be frozen actually meant practically, and brought the tool for it. The ice broke after 2 minutes of work, and the door swung open into darkness that smelled of old hay and cold earth. She went inside with the lantern and checked the interior, clear, structurally sound, the trough in the back corner still intact. She checked the second door at the far end, the wide one that the herd would need to come through, and cleared the ice from that latch as well. Then she went back out and all the way around the south fence line to check that the gaps were closed, which took longer than the shelter, but was necessary because a gap in the wrong place during a panicked herd movement was the difference between controlled and disaster. She found one gap, third post from the corner, where the wire had come away from the post. She didn't have the tools to fix it properly, so she did what she could, pulled off her scarf and lashed the wire back to the post with it, tight, enough to hold for the night. By the time she got back to the ranch house, the first real snow was coming. The storm lasted 30 hours. In the first 6 of those hours, while Grant and Pete and Cal moved the herd, Lena kept the ranch house fire going, kept water heated, kept food ready and waiting, and managed the 3 things that needed managing from the house end. She tracked where the men were with the lantern signals they'd agreed on. She went out twice to break the ice on the water troughs near the barn so that the horses didn't go without. And she took inventory of the medical supplies in the kitchen cabinet because people got hurt in storms, and she wanted to know what she had before she needed it. She also thought about hail. The storm gave her time to think, and she used it, sitting by the fire in the early morning hours when the wind was loudest and the men were still out, going over the shape of what she knew and what she didn't. He would hear, probably by the end of the week, that Grant had been to the neighboring ranchers. He would know his strategy was compromised. He would move quickly after that. She was increasingly certain of it. And the question she hadn't been able to answer yet was which direction he'd move in. He could leave. That was one option, and she acknowledged it as a real one, because sometimes when you called a bluff, the man folded. But she'd spent enough time now studying how Clifton Hale operated to doubt it. He was not a man who folded. He was a man who changed tactics. What could he do practically? He couldn't force a sale. He couldn't force the marriage. She'd established that clearly enough. He could try to damage Grant's reputation or his business relationships, but Grant had 15 years of standing in this community and Hale had 3 months. She kept coming back to the land. The land was what he actually wanted. If he couldn't buy it legitimately and couldn't create the social pressure that would make people grateful to sell to him, what was the other way to acquire land that someone didn't want to sell? She was still working on that when the door opened at 4 a.m. and Grant came in, covered in snow from his shoulders to his boots, and sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. She put a bowl of stew in front of him without asking. He ate half of it before he said anything. "We got them all through," he said. "Lost one calf. It was already weak. This didn't help. But the main herd's in the shelter and the south field, and they're all right." The latch on the south shelter was iced. I cleared it, and there was a gap in the fence, third post from the corner. I lashed it with my scarf. It should hold until the thaw. He looked up from the bowl. Something moved in his face. Not surprised, not anymore, but something warmer than that. "You went out in this?" "You were managing 300 cattle," she said. "A fence post is less complicated." He looked at her for a long moment, with the snow still melting off his coat and the fire behind her throwing its light, and whatever was in his face had moved past measured and past careful, and was sitting in a place she'd been trying not to name for weeks. "Lena," he said. "Eat your stew," she said quietly. "You can say whatever it is when you're warm." He looked at her. Then he looked back at the bowl and ate. She sat across from him and drank her cold tea, and the storm pushed at the windows, and the fire held. When he was done, he pushed the bowl aside and put both hands on the table, and she looked at those hands, calloused and capable, the hands of a man who'd built something with them, and waited. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to understand that I am aware of the situation, that you work for me, that there are practical reasons why this is complicated." "I'm aware of them too," she said. "I'm not asking you to, He stopped, started differently. "4 years ago, I told myself that this house was going to be what it was. I was going to manage it and maintain it, and that was going to be enough." His voice was even, but careful, the way his voice got when the words mattered. "And then you came here, and you washed the curtains and fixed the porch board and organized the accounts and sat in Mercer's office asking exactly the right questions. And—" He stopped again. He looked at her. "I'm aware of how this sounds." "How does it sound?" she said. "Like a man who doesn't know how to say a simple thing simply." She looked at him for a moment. "Then say it simply," she said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper, or not only as the housekeeper." A beat. "I want you to stay because when I come home, I'm coming home. That's what's changed. That's what you've done to this place, and I don't know how to—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to answer now. I'm not asking you to answer at all if the answer is no. I just needed to say it." The fire moved in its grate. The storm pressed at the walls. She'd told herself carefully and methodically, and many times over the past months, all the reasons why this was something she should not let herself feel. She was 23, and he was 40, and she had no money of her own, and he had this ranch and its complications. And there was a man in a hotel in Harlan's Fork who wasn't finished with either of them, and she had come here running from one entanglement and didn't need to walk straight into another. She'd told herself all of it. She'd believed it as well as she could. "I know," she said quietly, and then because she'd promised herself she was done not saying true things when they needed saying, "I feel it too. I have for a while." He looked at her. "But not tonight," she said. "You're tired, and the storm's still going, and we've got things ahead of us that need to be dealt with first. We'll find the time for the rest of it." He held her gaze for a moment. Something settled in his face, not disappointment, not relief, but something more solid than either. The kind of expression a person gets when they've said a true thing out loud and the other person received it the same way. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He went to bed. She banked the fire. She sat alone in the kitchen for a while in the good warm darkness and listened to the storm working itself out against the roof. And she thought about how strange it was that you could come to a place running away from something and find that what you'd run toward was the thing that mattered. The storm broke on the second day and left the world white and still and very quiet. And 3 days after that, while the snow was still heavy on the ground, Douglas Pratt filed an emergency petition with the county court. Mercer sent word immediately. The petition claimed that Lena was living in circumstances detrimental to her welfare and moral standing and requested a hearing at which a judge would review her situation. It was signed by Douglas and co-signed, which was the part that stopped Lena cold when she read it, by 2 of the 3 neighboring ranchers Hale had been meeting with. Not Briggs, not Ruth, but the 2 others, men she and Grant had not reached in time or had not reached convincingly enough. She set the letter down on the kitchen table. She picked it up again. He pivoted, she said, when Grant came in and she handed him the letter. He read it. His face went hard. The 2 signatures. He got to them, or they were already his before we thought they were. She was thinking out loud, the way she did when she needed to work through something fast. He couldn't buy the land and he couldn't get me back. So he's trying to create the legal situation Mercer warned us about. A judge who looks at me living here and has to decide whether it's respectable. She paused. If the hearing goes badly, it damages your reputation and mine, and frighten people sell. The hearing's in 12 days, Grant said, reading the letter. I know. He looked up at her. What do you want to do? And the fact that he asked it that way, not what should we do, not what are our options, but what do you want, made something settle in her that she'd needed to have settle. I want to fight it, she said, properly, with documentation and testimony and everything Mercer can put together. Then that's what we do. He folded the letter. I'll ride to town this morning. I'll come with you, she said. He didn't argue. He got his coat. They rode to town together in the white quiet of the post-storm morning, the wagon leaving tracks in untouched snow, and Lena sat beside Grant Calloway on the bench and thought about the hearing ahead and all the things she'd need to prove and all the people she'd need to be convincing in front of. She thought about her father and his ledgers, his patience. She thought about her mother's silver comb in the tin box under her cot. She thought about a recipe box with firm opinions in the margins and a man who'd built accounts that only he could read, and a house that had been closed for 4 years and wasn't closed anymore. She had 12 days. She had Mercer and Ruth and Briggs and Cord, the deputy, and a clear record of her employment and her wages and every receipt she'd kept since the first week in October. She had the truth of what she'd done here and how she'd done it, and the truth, while it wasn't always enough, was where you started. It was always where you started. She was ready. Mercer spent 4 of the 12 days preparing and said almost nothing to either of them about how it was going, which Lena took as a sign that he was concentrating rather than that things were going badly, because Mercer was the kind of man who went quiet when he was working and talkative when he was worried. On the 5th day, he called them in and laid out what he had across his desk in organized stacks, and she looked at it and thought, it's enough. It has to be enough. The employment contract signed in October, witnessed by Donovan at the livery. Her wage records, which she'd kept in the same column format as the household accounts. Every payment, every date, clean and legible, and impossible to dispute. The sheriff's letter from November. A statement from Ruth Adler, written in Ruth's direct hand with no softening, describing her visits to the ranch and the conditions she'd observed and the character of the woman she'd found there. A statement from Cord, the deputy, describing the Saturday in the hotel dining room, what Lena had said, how she'd said it, the fact that she'd come alone and left alone and conducted herself with what he called, in his careful young man's phrasing, complete dignity. A statement from Vera Halston at the general store, which surprised Lena and shouldn't have, because Vera Halston saw everything and had strong opinions about it. And the public record documents that Mercer had compiled in March, the land office filings, the right-of-way inquiries, all of it, which would not be part of the formal hearing, but which Mercer intended to make available to the judge in a separate submission that framed the petition for what it actually was. The petition claims your circumstances are detrimental, Mercer said, looking at Lena over his glasses. What I intend to show is that the circumstances are the most documented and transparent employment arrangement in this county, and that the only detriment in evidence is to Mr. Hale's land acquisition plans. He paused. Judges generally dislike having their courtrooms used as commercial instruments. Generally, Lena said. Generally, he agreed. Judge Aldrin is in his 60s. He has presided in this district for 20 years. He has, in my experience, a consistent intolerance for men who waste his time. He looked at her steadily. You'll be asked to speak, not just through me. He'll want to hear from you directly. I know, she said. Are you ready for that? She thought about standing on Grant's porch in November in the cold, watching Douglas drive away. She thought about the hotel dining room and the held silence after she'd stood up and walked to the door. She thought about the south pasture fence in the storm dark, her hands on frozen wire, the scarf off her own neck. Yes, she said. Decab. The hearing was on a Tuesday, and half of Harlan's fork came. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. Not the numbers, which surprised her when she arrived at the courthouse and saw the benches already filling, but the specific people. Briggs and his wife, who had driven in from 12 miles out. The Sweeney boy, who had not fully committed when they'd visited him but was apparently willing to sit in a courtroom and see how it went. Vera Halston, Donovan from the livery, Pete and Cal in their good shirts, which she suspected they'd ironed themselves because there was nobody at the ranch to do it for them. An observation that would have made her smile at any other moment. And Ruth, who arrived early and sat in the front row on the left side and looked at Lena when she came in with an expression that said, "I am here, and you are not alone," without saying any of it. Lena sat at the table beside Mercer and put her hands flat on the wood in front of her and breathed. Hale and Douglas were at the other table. Hale had brought a lawyer from Cheyenne, a man named Ashworth, who wore an expensive suit and had the groomed confidence of someone who won cases in larger rooms than this. Douglas sat beside Hale and didn't look at Lena, which she noted and filed and let go of. Judge Aldrin came in at 9 o'clock, and the room stood and sat, and he settled behind the bench with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had seen most of what courtrooms contained and was rarely surprised by any of it. He had a broad, weathered face and white hair and glasses that he looked over rather than through, and when he read the petition summary Mercer had filed, something around his mouth went tight in a way that Lena thought might be promising. Ashworth went first. He was skilled. She gave him that. He laid out the argument smoothly and without obvious overreach. A young woman without family or independent means, residing in a wealthy bachelor's household. Her reputation a matter of community concern. The petition a responsible action by a guardian exercising appropriate care. He didn't say anything explicitly improper. He didn't have to. The structure of the argument was designed to make the imagination fill in what the words didn't say. Lena kept her face neutral and her hands still. Mercer went second. He was not smooth, he was precise, and there is a difference. He presented the employment contract, the wage records, the letters, the statements, each one laid before the judge in order, each one addressing a specific element of the petition's claims. He did not editorialize. He did not make speeches. He let the document speak, which was the right instinct because the document said everything. Then the judge looked at Lena. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I'd like to hear from you." She stood. She was aware of the room at her back, all those people, the weight of them, and she made herself look at Judge Aldrin rather than at Hale or Douglas or anywhere else. "Your Honor," she said, "I'll say 3 things. First, I am employed under a lawful contract at a fair wage, and I have fulfilled that contract without complaint or incident since October. The records Mercer submitted show that clearly. Second, I came to Callaway Ridge of my own free will, running from an arrangement made without my knowledge or consent, and every decision I've made since has been my own. No one compelled me to come here, and no one compelled me to stay." She paused. "Third, the men who filed this petition have a financial interest in the land surrounding Callaway Ridge that has nothing to do with my welfare. I'd ask the court to look at the right-of-way documents Mercer submitted separately and consider what this petition is actually for." She sat down. The room was quiet. Judge Aldrin looked at the separate submission Mercer had placed at the corner of his bench. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Ashworth. "Counsel," he said, "tell me about your client's land interests in this county." Ashworth's groomed confidence shifted slightly. "Your Honor, that's not germane to—" "I'll decide what's germane," the judge said. He said it without heat, which was somehow more effective than heat would have been. What followed was 40 minutes of the most uncomfortable silence Lena had ever observed, punctuated by short exchanges, during which Ashworth tried to maintain the position that Hale's business activities were entirely separate from the petition, and during which Judge Aldrin made increasingly clear through his questions alone that he found this position unpersuasive. Hale sat at the table with his jaw tight and his patience visibly costing him something. Douglas said nothing. He looked at the table. Lena looked at him once, briefly, and thought, "You are a small man who made a small choice, and it brought you here." She didn't feel the anger anymore. She felt something flatter, and more final than that. At 11 o'clock, Judge Aldrin dismissed the petition. He did it in 2 sentences. The petition presented no credible evidence of harm to the subject, and the court found the circumstances of her employment and residence to be entirely proper. He did not say anything about Hale's land interests, not directly, but he looked at Ashworth as he delivered the ruling with the expression of a man making a point without words, and Ashworth received it and looked away. Lena sat for a moment after the gavel came down. The room behind her erupted into a noise that was not quite applause. The courthouse didn't allow applause, but was the sound of 20 people exhaling at once and turning to one another. Mercer was gathering his papers. He glanced at her over his glasses. "Adequate outcome," he said, which for Mercer was effusive. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She stood and turned, and Ruth was already there, not saying anything, just standing there, and Lena thought she might not be entirely steady for a moment, and Ruth apparently thought the same thing because she put a hand on her arm, briefly, firmly, and then released it. "Come on," Ruth said. "There's a diner 2 streets over, and I'm buying you breakfast." Grant was beside her then. He'd been in the second row, and she'd known he was there without looking, the way you know where someone is in a room when you've been living alongside them for months. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, which said everything. None. Clifton Hale left Harlan's Fork 4 days after the hearing. He didn't leave quietly. Nothing about him was quiet. But he left conclusively. His rooms at the hotel were vacated, his horse gone from the livery, and the lawyer from Cheyenne presumably back on the road to somewhere his skills were more useful. Vera Halston reported that he'd paid his hotel bill without conversation and left before 7 in the morning, which was, Vera said, the behavior of a man who didn't want to be seen leaving. Douglas left 2 days after that. Lena heard about it from Mercer, who had received a communication from the county clerk in Whitfield confirming that the guardianship petition had been formally withdrawn. That was all it said. There was no message from Douglas himself, no letter, no acknowledgement of any kind. She stood in Mercer's office and held the notification and read it twice. "That's the end of it, legally," Mercer said. "Yes," she said. "The inheritance your father left. Douglas has been managing it for 3 years. Now that the guardianship claim is withdrawn, his authority over those funds is considerably murkier. You may want to consult with me about recovering what remains." She looked at him. "What do you think remains?" He was quiet for a moment, which was its own answer. "I'll consult with you about it," she said. "Thank you." She rode back to the ranch alone, which she did sometimes now, when she needed the road and the open air and the space to think without anyone near. The April sky was wide and the fields were showing green at the edges, the first tentative green that comes when the ground decides it's ready. And she rode through it and let the information from Mercer's office settle. Her father's money was probably mostly gone. She'd suspected that for a long time. Suspected it in the way you suspect things you don't want to confirm, so you don't look at them directly. Douglas had been managing it for 3 years, and Douglas was the kind of man who managed things primarily for his own benefit. Whatever was left, she would pursue through Mercer, methodically, in the same way she'd pursued everything else. But riding back to Callaway Ridge in the April morning, she found that the loss sat differently than she'd expected. Not lighter. It was still a loss, and she let it be that. But it was a loss that existed alongside things that hadn't existed when the money did. The job she'd done, the house she'd changed, the people she'd built something with, Ruth, who drank tea in the sitting room and said direct things, Pete and Cal, who had ironed their shirts for her hearing, Mercer, who called adequate outcomes adequate with the satisfaction of a craftsman, Cord the deputy, who had put his observations in writing because it was the right thing to do, and Grant. She thought about Grant for a while on that road, in the way she was finally allowing herself to think about him. Not sideways, not carefully, but directly. She thought about the kitchen in the storm dark and what he'd said and what she'd said back, and the particular quality of the conversation they'd been having since, the one that existed in silences and in the way he'd started sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings again, not needing to talk but needing to be in the same room, the one that existed in the way she'd found herself doing the same thing. She'd been careful for so long. Careful made sense when you were running from something, when every step needed to be sure. But she wasn't running anymore. She'd stopped running somewhere between October and now and had started something else instead. Something that was harder to name but felt more like the actual shape of her life than anything she'd lived before. She found him on the porch when she rode in. He was sitting in the chair at the south end, the one that faced the ridge, and he had a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold, and he was looking at the ridge the way he sometimes did. Not blankly, but with the thinking look, the interior one. She put the horse up and came up the porch steps and stood beside him. She looked at the ridge. The snow was gone from it now, the rocks showing dark against the pale spring sky. Mercer confirmed Douglas withdrew the petition, she said. I heard, he said. Cord sent word this morning. The inheritance is likely mostly gone. I'm going to pursue what's left through Mercer. He'll do it right, Grant said. Yes. She looked at the ridge for another moment. Hale's going to move on. He'll find another county, another route, another set of landowners who don't know what their land is worth. That's what men like that do. Probably. But not here. Not this county. She looked at him. Because people know now. That doesn't unhappen. He looked at her. The afternoon light was the particular gold of Wyoming in April, the kind of light that doesn't try to be beautiful, but is, the way honest things sometimes are. What do you want to do? He said. He asked it simply, the same way he always did. Not framing it, not directing it, just asking. She'd been thinking about the answer to this question for weeks, not in the anxious way she'd thought about things when she first arrived, turning them over for danger and instability. In a quieter way, the way you think about things when you're not afraid of the answer. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have options now that I didn't have in October. I know that, and I know you know it too. She paused. I want to stay because this is where I want to be. That's the only reason that matters. He looked at her steadily. And the rest of it, he said. What I said in the kitchen. That too, she said. When we're ready. When we've given it the time it deserves to be something real, and not just something that happened because we were both here and the circumstances pushed us toward each other. I'm not doing this because of circumstances, he said. I know, she said. Neither am I. That's why I'm not in a hurry. She looked at him. Are you? Something moved in his face that was the closest she'd seen to the thing she thought of privately as his real expression. Not the guarded one, not the managing one, but the one underneath all the weathered practicality, the one that had been standing in a closed house for 4 years. No, he said, I can wait. Good, she said. She sat down in the other chair, the one beside his, and they both looked at the ridge, and the afternoon light moved across it the way it does when you're not watching for it, slowly, without asking. Spring came properly in May, the way it does in Wyoming when it finally makes up its mind, fast and green and slightly overwhelming after the long white months. The cattle came out of the winter shelter, and the south field looking ragged and hungry, and better than Grant had feared, which he said at breakfast one morning with the understated relief of a man who'd been calculating losses since February and was relieved to be wrong. Lena renegotiated her contract with him in May. She did it directly, sitting across the kitchen table with a piece of paper between them, and she laid out the terms she wanted: a higher wage, which the household accounts clearly supported, and a formal role managing both the household and the financial records she'd been keeping since October, which was the work she'd actually been doing and deserved to be recognized as such. Grant looked at the paper. You wrote this yourself. Of course. You're negotiating with me. I am. She met his eyes. Is that a problem? The corner of his mouth moved. No, he said. He signed it. She signed it beside his name, and she felt something settle in her that was the satisfying click of a thing put properly in its place. Not romantic, just right, the way right things feel when you've worked for them with your actual hands. Ruth came to dinner in May, the first dinner that was social rather than purely practical, and she sat at the table that Lena had set with the good dishes she'd found wrapped in cloth at the back of the dining room cabinet, and she looked at the house around her with the frank appraising eye of someone who'd known it for years. Helen would have approved of what you've done with the curtains, Ruth said. Grant looked at his plate. I found her recipe box, Lena said. Her opinion on pie crust is quite firm. Ruth looked at her, startled, and then laughed. The genuine kind, the short kind that comes out before you can decide whether it's appropriate. She had opinions on everything. The pie crust was mild by comparison. Grant looked up. Something moved across his face. Something that wasn't grief exactly, or not only grief, but the complicated thing that lives next to grief when a person starts to be able to think about the lost one without it flattening them. He looked at Lena for a moment, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. But Ruth watched the exchange and took a quiet sip of her coffee. After dinner, Ruth helped clear the table, which she'd never done before, and which Lena suspected was deliberate. And while Grant was in the other room, Ruth stood at the kitchen counter beside Lena and said, without preamble, "You did something hard and you did it right." "I did what needed doing," Lena said. "That's the same thing," Ruth said. "Most people don't do what needs doing. They do what's easy, or what's expected, or what won't draw attention. You went into a hotel dining room and said the true thing out loud in front of people who didn't know you, and then you drove home and made supper." She handed Lena a plate to dry. "That's not a small thing. I want you to know that someone noticed it." Lena held the plate and looked at the window above the sink, at the dark outside where the spring night had settled. "I was scared," she said. "Every time. I want to be clear about that." "I know," Ruth said. "That's the point, isn't it?" In June, the railroad announced its route. The announcement came through the Harlan's Fork Gazette, a single column on the front page with a map that showed the line threading through the western ridge exactly as the survey documents had suggested it would. Within a week, land values along the corridor had shifted in ways that people were still calculating. Briggs drove out to the ranch specifically to shake Grant's hand and stayed for 2 hours because his wife wanted to talk to Lena about the garden she was starting on the ranch's south side, which was a conversation Lena hadn't expected to enjoy as much as she did. Sweeney, the younger rancher, came separately. He was sheepish about it, a young man who'd come close to making a decision he'd have regretted, and he knew it, and he sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and said he should have listened better in March. "You listened in time," Lena said. "That's what matters." "Barely," he said. "Barely still counts," she said. He left looking slightly less burdened than when he'd arrived, and she thought about that for a while after he was gone. About how people needed to be told that barely counts, needed it said plainly by someone who meant it, because we are all of us doing things barely sometimes, and the world generally doesn't give you credit for barely and should do it more. Her father would have had something precise to say about that. She wished she could have told him about this year. She thought he would have recognized the shape of it, not the romance, which would have made him quiet and careful in his fatherly way, but the work of it, the systematic dismantling of an injustice through patience and documentation, and the willingness to say the true thing out loud even when your hands were shaking. He'd taught her that. She'd forgotten for a while that he had. The year had given it back to her, chat. The evening of the day the railroad announcement came out, Grant found her on the porch in the same chair she'd been sitting in the afternoon he'd said what he'd said, the one facing the ridge, which was still the ridge, unchanged by any of what had happened below it. He sat in the other chair. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. The June evening was warm in the way Wyoming evenings are when the season finally means it, and the ridge caught the last of the light. "The land assessor came by this morning," Grant said finally, "while you were in the garden." "What did he say?" "The property values increased significantly, the part that borders the corridor especially." A pause. "We're comfortable, more than comfortable. I want you to know that because it changes what's possible." She looked at him. "Possible for what?" He looked at the ridge. "For anything you want to do. Whether you stay here or whether at some point you want to establish something of your own, the wages we agreed on, and what Mercer's able to recover from Douglas's management of your father's estate, and—" He stopped. "I'm not saying this well. You're saying you want to make sure I have options," she said. "Yes." "Even if the options include leaving?" "Yes." He looked at her then. "I meant what I said in the kitchen, all of it. But I didn't mean it as, I don't want you here because you need to be here. I want you here because you choose to be." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had stood in Douglas's kitchen drying dishes that weren't hers, listening to two men discuss her future like it was a line item in an account. She thought about $11.40 in a tin box. She thought about the drive out here through open country with nothing certain at the other end. I know the difference, she said, between choosing and needing. I learned it this year. She paused. I'm choosing. He held her gaze. All right, he said quietly. The word that meant more than it was. All right, she said. The light moved on the ridge the way it always did, slow and indifferent and quietly beautiful in the way that real things are, and they sat in it together, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. What Lena understood by summer, not as a thought exactly, but as a thing she felt in the daily texture of her life, was that belonging isn't something that gets handed to you. It gets built slowly with your actual hands, in the small hours and the cold mornings and the moments when you're scared and you do the thing anyway. You build it out of swept floors and honest accounts and fence posts fixed with your own scarf. Out of saying the true thing in a room full of people who are waiting to see if you will. Out of staying when it would have been easier to go and choosing when you could have settled for needing. She had been 23 years old and invisible, the girl nobody wanted, passed between people who saw her as useful in the way a tool is useful, until you need to put it down. And she had run from that, and she had been lucky, and she had been smart, and she had worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life, and all of it had been necessary. But the luck, and the smart, and the hard work had only put her somewhere she could build from. The building was the thing. The building was what she'd done. The house at Callaway Ridge smelled like bread on Saturday mornings, and had clean curtains, and a recipe box on the kitchen shelf with strong opinions in the margins, and a ledger system that two people could now read. It had a man in it who'd been alone for 4 years and wasn't anymore, and a woman in it who'd been invisible for most of her life and was standing, finally, in full daylight. It was not a perfect house. Grant was still hard to reach sometimes, still went quiet in the interior way that could last for days, still flinched at the things that reminded him of what he'd lost. And she had learned not to push those moments, to let them be what they were and stay nearby. She was still cautious in ways that occasionally frustrated him, still turned problems over longer than he thought necessary before she spoke, still kept her tin box under the cot, even though she had a real chest of drawers now. They were both still themselves, imperfectly, the way people are. But the house held, and the land held, and the ridge stood at the end of every day against whatever sky the season put behind it, solid and indifferent and present, and that was enough to build from. It had always been enough to build from. What mattered was that she'd known it.